hierarchy is quite an interesting word. When I think that word, I imagine a very big edifice, a kind of architectural structure that you might say reaches for the sky, as it were, pretty much like the first pyramid, the step pyramid, that was a step mound, and it was a form of a magic mountain up which you climb to the heavens, the stairway to heaven, or the course of the sunboat to the stars via the solar system. And the thought of a hierarchy is, I think, fundamental to the very structure of language itself, or the structure of knowledge. So I would think that a hierarchy is really a system of knowledge. And so when you have an idea, which you could say is an archetypal principle, or a prime mover, so that would be at the apex of the pyramid. And so you could say it's that which moves or gives momentum to the whole structure. And you could put at the apex the word inspiration to give that level a neutral terminology. You could say that inspiration is the inspiration to create. So an artist will create a painting. So I'm saying from that initial point, the point of the apex of the pyramid, that prime mover makes the whole edifice intelligible. And by implication, the intelligible would be intellectually built. And therefore, you could say the whole thing is a paradigm or a theory. And of course, when you have a theory, you want to put it into practice. So you have an inspiration and you create the structure that will serve the purposes of that initial inspiration, the initial idea. And you can call that idea God, you can call that idea a Platonic form, you could call that idea the One, the Tao, the Dharma, the law. So however you envision the process of ideation in consciousness, you can imagine that there's always the seed, the point, out of which the tree, or the tree of life as it were, in the Kabbalistic sense, unfolds from Katha, which means I am, or existence. So the I am, the existence, is really the identity that's first formed in consciousness by language. So you could say either an image, a word, or a number was, you might say, in a kind of triune or tripartite way, those three elements were part of the origin. The Trinity was encoded in the primordial point, the seed. So you might say the initial language was the foundation of the creation of any form of system of knowledge which works from a first principle, you might say. And so that idea, that concept, is the underlying inspiration, the driving force. So you could say that such ideas as love, beauty, truth, justice, freedom, unity, understanding, providence, insight, all of those things could be foundation stones, as it were, for any particular modelling of a hierarchy. So if you take the Catholic Church, has been one of the longest lasting hierarchies. And so within the Church, within the system of Christianity, the system of knowledge that's Christianity, then every sector of society, every sector of culture was involved within the religious framework. And in the same way, in the modern state, the national state, then they've taken over from the church, and so everyone works, you might say, in a secular society for the hierarchy of the state. For me, it's very difficult to conceive of a hierarchy from the standpoint of the one, for example. So that means within the one, which is a form of emptiness, there are no conditions or contexts or categories that we might assign in consciousness to thought, which is really the process out of which knowledge is formulated in the memory. When we're dealing with the one, we're dealing with wisdom, and wisdom essentially is a mystery. So if you take the idea of intelligent insight, so if you're working on the quantum field and you have intelligent insight, that intelligence, you might say, penetrates the problem and perceives the truth within, you might say, the confusion and chaos of the present system of knowledge, which is inadequate to meet the needs within the present investigation into the quantum field. Then you have an intelligent insight. So that would be where, from a spiritual point of view, you would have an insight into any system of knowledge within consciousness. And that intelligent insight, by implication, you might say, would bring with it a sense of wisdom. So you could say the essence of learning to solve problems based on systems of knowledge is really the activity of wisdom. So in Tibetan Buddhism they call the opening of the third eye, which enables Bodic insight, enlightened insight, is also referred to as intuitive wisdom. I mean, in the hierarchical nature of Tibetan Buddhism, you have the one mind at the apex, as it were. That would be Buddhahood itself. And Buddha would have put on the diamond body or the body of wisdom. And then out of that indivisible realm, you would have the emanation of spiritual perceptions, which are kind of aspects of Buddhahood or aspects of the Godhead. And they would be in a more visionary level or a more perceptual level, known as the intelligible realm in Plotinus. And Plotinus, a Neoplatonist, he put the one in the place of the one mind. So you would have the one mind or the one. Then you would have the body of perfect endowment or the intelligible realm, which are really the spiritual intelligences that embody love and truth and beauty and justice and compassion. And in any individual, when you're inspired from a spiritual level and you're a creative artist, then you will paint something beautiful, something orderly, something with understanding and insight, or with intelligence, or with love and beauty. So in a sense, through the inspiration, then the whole unfolding of the tree of life, or the unfolding of a painting, or the unfolding of a relationship, would, you might say, aspire to manifest through consciousness an objective spiritual perception. And that's why we have geniuses and creative people with intelligent insight, or Bodic insight, or intuitive wisdom. You could say that as you grow up, each child is exposed to a hierarchy, you might say, in the cosmos itself, in solar systems and galaxies. Then it's exposed to the natural order, which is a hierarchy, and then exposed to society, civilization, which is also a hierarchy. And then when people become religious and they theorize about a religious paradigm, then they become hierarchical as well. And so do all other systems of knowledge within consciousness, which is predicated on language, which itself builds up a hierarchy of meaning, a hierarchy of understanding. I think some people find hierarchy formidable, and they probably have a relationship of authority and fear. So like children, they learn to fear authority, basically, the father, the teacher, the policeman, the military, the politician, the boss, who certainly when I grew up in the 50s, they would have all been male, mainly male. And in the 50s, they did believe in corporal punishment, so they could actually hit you and actually injure you. If we're born, as I think, as selves, and the child up until 2 or 3, whatever, that they are themselves as a whole. So when you see the child, just playing or walking about, etc., then you think, the child is sensed as a whole, and basically moves its body, feels and thinks and whatever as a whole. So you could say there's a kind of inbuilt unity of perception and a kind of oneness of being. And I think that is fairly obvious in a child. And I'm saying that self is present in that child because before consciousness forms out of memory and language, which becomes, you might say, purely conscious based, so you begin to control what you think, control what you do in society within the family. And that has a kind of self-interest, it has an ego, it has an identity. So in a sense you behave more or less territorially, you have your own possessions, you have your own opinions, you have your own feelings. And in a way you'll come into friction with the family and you'll try to assert your own individuality within that collective group mind. So at some point the indoctrination or cultural conditioning means that you can't refer back to yourself in a non-verbal way, in the sense that the self is simply yourself. And the illusion is that you are your identity. So the child's a self and becomes the son or daughter. But in fact, we're each self. No matter what persona, mask we wear, we are self, basically. And so if we live most of our lives in our consciousness, bounded by hierarchy, then we're always answerable to each other within that hierarchy, because consciousness itself is a field of identity. And so every single identity, every single personality, every aspect of knowledge, every aspect of experience, all of that, you might say, constitutes the field of identity. And so out of taking a walk and you look at various wildflowers, then that might lead you one day to be a botanist, etc. And so you systematize the knowledge within your consciousness in that particular way. Or when you raise a family, then you systematize the kind of structure of the family and all the psychology and all the tradition and customs and laws and just endless information you have coming into your mind from society, telling you at every step of the way what you're supposed to do, what we've done in the past, what we've inherited, what the tradition is, what the law is. So we're all conforming to a hierarchy, whether we like it or not. And every time we speak, language is formulating a hierarchy. One thing is being played off against another, one identity against another. So there's an implicit argument, there's an implicit difference, there's an implicit need to, you might say, not necessarily overtly control and dominate the other identity. That could be a brother and sister, it could be two politicians, or it could be two men in rival for a woman or something. So however well systematized and ritualized the edifice of the hierarchy is, within the family, within the school, within any form of institution, within the monarchy, within parliament, within big business, all hierarchical, because consciousness is founded on language, and in the religious mythic sense there's a hierarchy of mythical gods and goddesses. And in the hierarchy of modern society, you might say you have the professional class, the managerial class, and the kind of oligarchs of business pulling the strings. They're the puppet masters. And the hierarchy will, in a sense, reward you for what you accomplish in the name of that particular hierarchy. And you will gain power and stay in power as long as you strengthen a belief in the hierarchy. So all hierarchies based on knowledge are really belief systems. So science itself is a belief system. Art is a belief system. Every time you communicate what you know and what you think, that's a belief system. Because you want people to believe in what you say. And if they trust you, then you believe them. And of course, what happens is, the idea is that the higher up you go, the less you can trust the people at the top. Because their motives at the top might be limited by so many other factors within society that all hierarchies, you might say, bring pressure to bear on each other. So there is, even at the top, there's an implicit rivalry, and what any particular hierarchy, good or evil, has to do is to maintain authority and control and dominance. As I say, they could do it altruistically or they could do it malevolently. It doesn't really matter if we're dealing with the survival of a autonomous hierarchy. So you could say in the Catholic Church they overlooked pornography and paedophilia. They had the power to do that. And part of the glue that kept the institution working within the Catholic hierarchy was tolerance of paedophilia, tolerance of gratification, and you know, for the sacrifice of the celibate priest, or the sacrifice of the monk, or the sacrifice of the higher echelon within the Vatican, etc., then they want compensation. They want some level of pleasure, some level of influence and power. And so you have all these temptations. So you have a delineation of taboo. And each person has inbuilt, you might say, an implicit taboo based on the fear that there are things you mustn't do within your own psychology, within your own emotional nature, because it might upset the system within your own hierarchy, within your body and your mind, which is a hierarchy of the brain at the top, as it were, and in the psyche, whatever guiding principle, be it God or inspiration or the one or nirvana, whatever your conception of the prima mobile is, the prime mover of your hierarchical system of knowledge. And so there must be taboos in order to maintain the elite position, say, of the positive or the negative. So if it's the devil at the top or it's Christ at the top, then you know, each hierarchy has to conform and to carry out the wishes of the powers that be. So in my own case, I feel all of my adult life has been in service to the One. I wasn't brought up in a religious way. I've never believed in anything. I've simply studied mythology, basically. But I've come to understand more recently that my system of knowledge basically alludes to the One, and I'm quite happy with that terminology. So I've had synchronicities, visions, and other dreams, etc., that have alluded to the fact that I'm in the service of the One. So I'm processing knowledge within the service of the One, and that knowledge includes the ambiguity between good and evil, for example, or the ambiguity between the warring opposites that make up the very structure of consciousness, the very structure of language, which you might say, in one sense, one word is always vying with another, one word is always warring with the other. Because at any moment in conversation, you can change around the words to mean completely their opposite. And it's a very, very subtle thing when you're communicating what you feel, or communicating what you imagine, or communicating a system of knowledge which requires constant transformation, because nothing's static in consciousness. However fixed you become, the very development of language and history and culture means that at some point you'll be left behind if you don't adapt. And what's so extraordinary about, say, Buddhism, how well it adapts, as far as I'm concerned, to the modern period, because the primary insights of Buddhism refer to an actual process. So the idea of enlightenment or initiation enlightenment, for me, is an objective process of knowledge that affects the psyche and the body, especially in what you call tantric kundalini, which is a naturally occurring process in the organism. So in my own case, serving my own kind of hierarchy of the One is no different from, say, getting a job in an institution and going there and working in whatever level you work at, and you're working within that institution. It's very complex. You don't know what people are doing at the top. You don't know everybody's motives. But as an institution, it seems to be working. It's working within the law. It's working within tradition. and there's no reason to think that there's anything essentially corrupt about it. So I would imagine that all institutions that have survived from the past, that have a deep level of history and tradition, I would say politically, religiously, philosophically, academically, I think those institutions will survive. And they've created a democracy, they've created a parliamentary system of government, they've created law and order, etc. And also given the leisure time for academic study, scientific research, and other aspects of the creative arts, so that modern society from the early 20th century has been a very dynamic, prosperous and illuminating period. And so I'm all for all of the traditional institutions that have provided for the individual within the 20th century plenty of room to maneuver, to be creative, to be alone, to be individual, to do something outside of the collective herd instinct, etc. But even for the more avant-garde creative people, that working inevitably within the hierarchy, if they want any degree of success in society, then you could say, because they're working implicitly within the hierarchy of the state or whatever, then they're playing the game of authority and fear. So again, there's probably something within each individual, as long as they remain within the field of consciousness, that they are working for a system of knowledge based on hierarchy, then there will be authority and fear. And ultimately, I think the power of any authority is the power to kill. I think when you're dealing with the high-powered institutions that govern the world on every level, then you're really dealing with the power that has the power to kill. So in the past, if you didn't go to church on Sunday, they could kill you. If you didn't go to fight in a war, they can kill you. If you don't go to work in the factory, they can kill you. And you could say that in the hierarchy, there are all degrees of destruction, or killing, or deprivation, and all kinds of psychological harassments, of creating envy and jealousy and arrogance and retaliation. So, there's a lot of pettiness, a lot of banality of evil, and just general exploitation and psychological manipulation. But I think, again, that's human nature, that's the human condition, and in microcosmic form it's institutionalized. So, dealing with what the facts are that human nature being what it is, then I think the warring opposites of one identity playing off against another, whether it's two artists that are trying to sell their paintings to a particular gallery, or it's a brother and sister arguing over, you know, who should learn to play the piano, or who should do this, or who should do that. So there's all the psychology going on. People in power know how to manipulate the psychology and the sociology of society and such. And my own kind of civility within my own system or my own hierarchy is, on the one hand, unfair, because I'm being controlled by a part of my organism, part of my psyche, which can be manipulated. So you could say each child in the conditioning process of society learns how to manipulate, but also allows themselves to be manipulated. So there's this reciprocity between, you might say, or a compromise or a reconciliation, a transformation between identities, between two dominant factions or two rival factions. So you could say that within the framework of history, civilization, society, whether it's tribal or modern, power, however fixed it might be, say within the Catholic Church or within the Buddhist community, going on for 2,000, 2,500 years, you could say that if you grow up without religion, as I did, then in your worldview, for example, when I went around Oxford as a child, growing up, I would have had no awareness of what religion meant. So when I saw churches and I had a friend that was a Catholic, etc., I would never engage in any form of conversation about religion, because religion had no reality. So, for example, you could, if you're interested in a particular kind of music and they're playing it, you know, in a building, and then next door there's a completely different kind of music, you may never go in that other building. So likewise, if you're brought up more secular like me, you would never ever internalize religion. So religion would never be part of your thought process and how you filter information. Now, if that's the case, that people can live their whole life independent of other systems of knowledge, so you could be in a remote part of the world, you could be working the land in some mountain area and hardly ever come in contact with civilization, etc. And you could say, is that person, however remote, however isolated, however their conditioning brought them to that place, are they really missing anything? Because the idea would be, say Europe, you think all the privileges in modern Europe from, say, the Renaissance, you know, the high esteem of the European mind, as it were. And then you went to some more primitive society and think that they're not enjoying freedom and the understanding of science and the understanding of all the systems of knowledge of European thought. And it's very difficult not to make a comparison, as you would between, say, classical music and jazz. You can make a comparison and work out a value system to do with the two pieces of music. Or you could compare two countries, or you can compare two people, two writers, two artists. And so, in a sense, by implication, every identity compares itself to every other identity. Every identity plays off against other identities. And there's always an oscillation between the top of the pyramid and the bottom of the pyramid. So that authority at the top and that fear at the bottom could turn into, say, the people at the bottom being part of a revolution. So they could in turn threaten that authority. So there's always a kind of, you might say, ambivalence and a play between certainty and uncertainty, or security and insecurity within any hierarchy. Nothing in consciousness is permanent. Nothing in consciousness is stable. Nothing in consciousness is actually grounded, because it's simply a process of thought. But everything we've built in the world around us, in history and society, in Aboriginal, medieval or modern society and culture, it's all been manufactured by thought and imagination and consciousness. And if you went to another planet and there were intelligences with consciousness, they can have a totally different reality than we have. So the Egyptians are different than the Greeks. The Greeks are different from the Indians from the Chinese. So I feel I just did my work. I don't know what the ultimate plan was. I don't know what the authority, the one, as it were, at the top, what that one actually wants. I did my best to do my work, to dream my dream and to write my books, etc. I just did that. You could say within society generally, I mean, the artist, the writer, we're all serving society. We're all part of a collective. We're all part of the species and the globe. Whether we realise it or not, or we're cognizant or not. But in a sense, you could say within consciousness, each identity is in service to every other identity, whether that's through authority and fear, or you might say beneficence and kindness. So I see consciousness, hierarchy, the field of knowledge, the field of identity, field of language. I see consciousness, hierarchy, thought as something objectively real to each person. We're kind of in the matrix, as it were, and there seems to be no escape. I mean, if you have a body and a brain, you're under the authority of that brain, as it were. Your body's under the command of the brain. So likewise, in your consciousness, you're under the command of the intelligence that you might say supersedes consciousness. So I would refer to that intelligence as the enlightened ones. So if you're in service to the enlightened ones, then in a way, a communion with the enlightened ones through the mediation of your own consciousness would manifest as revelation, which includes synchronicity and visions and dreams, etc. And so my work was to decode those symbolic mythological motifs within my own story, within my own life. But I don't know objectively why that's the case, why I had to do what I did. I know that it was part of the study of mythology, but I don't understand exactly what the whole process meant. Yes, I wrote different books, but as a whole, from a kind of overview, I don't actually know what that particular study was all about. And it's the same way. I mean, people within science think that what they know from a scientific perspective is really what's going on within science, within the hierarchy of the scientific establishment. But what I would say is what we call science within consciousness, which is a system of knowledge, is not separate from any other system. So you could say all systems of knowledge within cultural conditioning are being conditioned from intelligences outside of the purview of consciousness. And that intelligible realm is, you might say, holistically embodying within, say, the principle of truth, the whole truth about consciousness. And the whole truth about consciousness is all systems of knowledge are part of a, you might say, primal ground of language. And that primal ground of language is based on number, idea, and image. So basically, within consciousness, which is based on knowledge, even though most of the time we know what we're doing in the family, we know what we're doing when we go shopping, we know what we're doing when we work in institutions and politics and international affairs and business and everything, we think we know what we're doing. Now, that's true within consciousness. But if you have a moment of transcendence, a moment of enlightenment, then you realize something quite different is going on within the human being, other than the perambulations of consciousness and knowledge. And that other thing that's going on is really an insight that the one is working in the background, the enlightened beings are working in the background, and they are the knowers, the seers and the knowers, and that they are really in a domain of the unknown, beyond consciousness. So everything that's known in consciousness, in a sense, from the perspective of the one, is really embodied or enfolded by the unknown. So no matter what you know in science, there will always be the unknown. So every system of knowledge begins with the known and ends with the unknown, because every question will be answered and then another question will arise, and that whole cycle of inquiry, you might say, is self-generated, self-perpetuated within consciousness. So it's a self-regulatory system. You could say the entelechy of consciousness is its self-creative ability, because it's coming out of inspiration, it's coming out of creation. So the intelligible realm of the One is creating the phenomenology of consciousness in terms of thought or thought forms, and the explanation and interpretation of those thought forms that tell us about our inner life and our outer life, about what we think about and what we do in the world around us. And we have to try to be objective by making what we're thinking intelligible to ourselves, and philosophically that will take us towards the highest level of understanding in self-reflection, and in the moment of transcendence or satori, enlightenment, then we can make contact directly with the intelligible realm or the enlightened ones by implication, and then we have a sense of freedom from the limitations of consciousness. So God really represents freedom, or Buddhahood, the liberation from cultural conditioning, or the veil of Maya, illusion. So it's not a matter of hierarchy being a blessing or a curse. It's the fact that the whole nature of the physical universe and the psychic dimension is hierarchical. And we do the best to serve whatever the system of knowledge is under which we work. And we have to work that out for ourselves. What is the belief system that we're a part of? What is the world view? What is the underlying theory? What's the underlying concept? Or the underlying icon? Or mythological motif? For example, the One. And if we begin to think about the One, and we model our system of knowledge on the study of the One in terms of various religions, various systems of occultism and magic and all of that, and we work out globally what the One signifies, and that will always be the case within consciousness. There will always be something to implement, there will always be something to think about and project into society through consciousness. So in that sense, self-inquiry never ends. So even for Buddha, if Buddha was enlightened, he was evidently a spiritual teacher, so he would have to have adapted his teaching to whatever the prevailing consciousness was around him. So he would internalize the consciousness of the society around him and integrate that into a system of knowledge which works in accordance to his experience and his insight into the one mind. So maybe he emphasized justice, maybe he emphasized love or beauty or truth, and would try to have, you might say, manifest those spiritual perceptions, in a sense, imbuing the system of knowledge with meaning and understanding, so that in that body of knowledge will be an instance of wisdom, an instance of insight, an instance of the numinous presence of the One, which points beyond the system of knowledge itself. So the Buddha's teaching would point beyond the teaching to Buddha himself. So in the communication between the identity in Buddha's consciousness and the identity of the people around him, there will be an attempt to understand and unify with the teacher, and at the same time being moved numinously towards the understanding of the One being within yourself, and that through a communion with Buddha, through a communion with the One, then you yourself would become enlightened. And when you're enlightened, then you're no longer working within the dominion of the hierarchy, within the dominion of consciousness. So for the Buddha, the system of knowledge within consciousness would simply be the knowledge necessary for his intelligence to manifest, you might say, the means of connecting to the essence of his teaching, and therefore go beyond it.